close your eyes. Breathe in slow. And imagine a world without light. No lamps. No electricity. No glow from a screen. Just stars, and fire, and silence. It is the 13th century. The cobbled streets are slick with rain. The only music is the sound of rats chewing grain in a sack. And under a frayed hood, in the shadow of a collapsing roof, you crouch, watching. You are an assassin. Not a glamorous one. Not the kind with twin blades and a city map. No. You're the kind that hasn't bathed in for weeks. Your cloak is crusted with something that used to be blood, or soup, or both. You live behind a butcher's shop. Not in it, behind it. Next to the pile of bones they don't sell. And tonight, like most nights, you're not hunting evil kings or corrupt bishops. You're waiting for a drunk man to stumble home, so you can stab him in the dark. This is your life. This is what they don't put in the legends. Let me tell you how bad it really was. You were paid in secrets and moldy bread. Assassins in stories get gold coins. They flip them in candlelight and smirk, but you get half a loaf of something called bread, but it's green. And still warm. Not from baking, but from the rat that slept on it. The man who hired you wore a bag on his head. He told you the target's name and promised a favor. He didn't say what kind. And he never looked you in the eye. That was 3 weeks ago. You haven't seen him since. But you did get another message. Written in chicken blood on a cabbage leaf. It said he knows, so you moved again. To village is over. Now you sleep in a shed. With goats. They don't like you. One kicked you in the face yesterday. You apologized. This is your job. Silence. Blood. Rotten carbs. No songs will be written for you. No one will toast your name. But the goats remember. They always remember. You didn't have tools. You had trash. A real assassin needs tools, poisons, grappling hooks, smoke bombs, but you've got a bent fork, a chipped flask of vinegar, and a small sack of ashes you stole from a chimney. Your blade is more like a broken scissors. You tied the halves together with horsehair. It cuts about as well as a spoon. For stealth, you rub mud on your face. You think it helps. But really, it just smells like the river. The bad part of the river. Your shoes. One is leather. The other is a wooden bowl tied with twine. You walk in circles when you're not thinking. When it's time to strike, you don't leap from rooftops. You ease from the second floor and land in a puddle. You hope the splash will mask the sound of your groan. And somehow, you still manage to finish the job. It just takes a little longer. And leaves you with a limp. You once used a turnip as a distraction. It worked. But you never got it back. You still think about that turnip. It was your best weapon. No one trusted you. And they were right. Every time you entered a village, eyes followed you like a slow wind. Children hid behind barrels. Dogs growled from under carts. Old men crossed themselves when you passed. And they weren't wrong. You were there for a reason. A quiet reason. A sharp reason. But what they didn't know was that you didn't want to be there either. You hated the job. The sneaking. The cold. The guilt that crept in every time you saw a family hug goodnight through the cracks in their door. You told yourself you were doing it for justice. But it was hard to remember what justice even meant, when your hands were stained and trembling, and your only blanket was a stolen curtain. You didn't smile. You didn't laugh. Because laughter echoed. And echoes drew suspicion. And suspicion got you hand, so you kept your hood low, you kept your steps silent. And you told no one your name, not even yourself. You slept in places that shouldn't be slept in. Assassins don't get ins. They don't get beds. They get corners. And crawl spaces. And under things. One night, You slept in the hollow of a tree. It rained. The tree filled with frogs. One of them sat on your chest until morning. You named him Arnold. He left without saying goodbye. Another night, you curled up behind a church bell. The bell rang at sunrise. Your ears haven't recovered. You still hear birds when there are no birds. Sometimes, you sleep in hay. Sounds cozy, right? Until you realize the hay is crawling. With tiny legs. And tiny teeth. You learn to sleep with one eye open. Then you learn to sleep with both open. Then you don't sleep at all. Just close your eyes for moments. Little blackouts. Soft falls into nothing. You dream of soup. Warm rooms. Real blankets. Then you wake up with straw stuck in your nose and a chicken pecking your eyebrow. But you keep going. Because there's nowhere else to go. Getting caught wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Most people think getting caught means death. Quick. Final. Clean. But not for you. Not in the Middle Ages. Not as an assassin. You weren't just punished. You were used. Dragged through the mud. Paraded before villagers as a warning. The sheriff would yell, "This is what happens to shadows." Then came the cage. Hung above the square. Iron bars. No floor. Just you, swaying in the wind, while children threw beats at your knees. Some towns had worse. They'd stake your foot to the dirt and make you confess. Even if you had nothing to say. You'd babble about crows. About moonlight. About the shape of a man's breath in winter. They'd nod, then light the torch anyway. So you learned not to get caught. You moved like mist. You became part of walls. And when you walked, you left no footprints. But even so, some nights, you swore you could hear that cage creaking just behind you. Your targets were boring and sad. You imagined dukes. Lords. Evil men who kicked peasants and lit candles with gold coins. But no. Your targets were mostly accountants. Old. Tired. Smelling of onions and ink. One wore 7 scarves and cried during your approach. Another offered you soup before you struck. You said yes. It was terrible. But you still think about that soup. Sometimes, they weren't even bad. Just inconvenient. One man was killed because he whistled the wrong tune near the bishop's wife. Another because he knew too much about the mayor's goat. You didn't question orders. But your heart did, quietly. Late at night. When you stared at the beams in the ceiling and wondered if they could hold your weight. Not that you would. You weren't that dramatic. Just tired. Tired of lies. Of old men. Of goat scandals. But mostly, tired of yourself. You smelled like regret and mushrooms. Hygiene wasn't a thing. Not for anyone. And especially, not for assassins. You couldn't exactly carry soap. Or draw a bath. Or borrow someone's perfume. So you made do. With moss. With cold puddles. With ashes rubbed into your sleeves until the stench got confused and just gave up. You smelled like smoke, fear, and old stew. The boots you wore were made from stitched rabbit skin. They squished when wet. They always felt wet. Even when dry. Your cloak. Once black. Now, gray. With greenish stains you stopped asking about. You once tried to cover the smell with mint. You found a patch growing behind a tavern. You rubbed it on your armpits, on your face, even chewed it. It mixed with everything else. And now you smelled like moldy pie. People crossed the street when you passed. Dogs barked, chickens fled. Even shadows seemed to recoil. But you got used to it. Because the job wasn't about looking sharp. It was about disappearing. And no one follows the stink. You couldn't trust a soul. Not even your own. Every whispered job came with a warning. Say nothing. Tell no one. Leave no trace. And so you didn't. You became a ghost. But ghosts get lonely. Even the vengeful ones. You tried to make friends once. A candle maker who hummed while she worked. You bought wax just to hear her sing. Never spoke a word. Just listened. Then one night, you got an order. Your next target, a woman. No name, just a description. You didn't finish the job. You vanished instead. Left town. Left her. And somewhere in your bag, still wrapped in cloth, is that little wax candle she sold you. Unlit. And melted. Unforgotten. Another time, you saved a cat. From a well. Named it Edwin. He followed you for 2 weeks before he vanished in the night. You woke up missing his warmth. You blamed yourself. Because assassins can't have companions, not cats. Not friends. Not even memories. So you trained yourself to forget. But some faces refuse to be erased. You were always cold. Even when it was warm. You wore layers. So many layers. Wool. Linen. A second tunic with holes where your elbows used to be. But the cold still found you. Through stone walls. Through wet blankets. Through cracked leather gloves that used to belong to someone who no longer needed them. Even in summer, your fingers trembled. Your knees ached. Your breath misted out like a warning. Some nights, you pressed yourself between barrels just to steal the warmth of rotting apples. You crawled near chimney vents. Near bakeries. Near lanterns left too close to walls. Once, you burned your hand. Just to feel something that wasn't wind. The worst cold wasn't outside. It was under your ribs, settled like a stone. A frost that didn't melt with tea or time. You were alone. That kind of cold never left. And no matter how tightly you wrapped your cloak, you could still feel it breathing just behind your spine. Your food was a tragedy with no ending. You didn't eat like nobles. You didn't eat like peasants. You ate like someone hiding under a bridge, hoping the rats wouldn't notice. Stale bread, hard as stone, but with less flavor. Moldy cheese you scraped with a knife, only to find more mold underneath. Once, you tried rabbit. You caught it yourself. Built a fire in the woods. Cooked it slowly, carefully. Then remembered you forgot to skin it. You chewed through fur in the dark, listening for footsteps that never came. Another time, you drank from a barrel of rainwater and woke up hallucinating a choir of frogs chanting your name. You stopped drinking from barrels after that, most nights. Your dinner was dried beans, crunchy, sour, sometimes still moving, but you were grateful, because gratefulness was all you had. That, and an iron stomach. You missed apples. You missed warmth. But mostly, you missed flavor. The pay was as bad as the morals. You risked your life, daily. In silence. In shadow. You jumped off roofs. Sprinted across tiles. Dodged arrows, knives, suspicion. And for what? 3 copper coins. A stale loaf. Maybe a chicken, if your contact felt generous. Once, they gave you a turnip. Just a turnip. As if that somehow paid for your broken ribs. You tried to negotiate. They laughed. Then reminded you that assassins don't form unions. Another time, you were promised gold. The bag jingled. Later, you discovered it was filled with pebbles and one dead beetle. You named the beetle Richard. He lived in your pocket for a week before you lost him in the river. Even when the money came, you couldn't spend it. Too risky. Gold draws eyes. Eyes draw questions. Questions get you killed. So you buried your coins behind a stable in a village you never returned to. And the only thing you ever bought was silence. People didn't see you. And that hurt more than knives. You weren't meant to be noticed. That was the point. You walked with eyes down. Shoulders hunched. Breath soft. You passed through crowds like fog through ruins. But sometimes, you wanted someone to say hello. to ask your name, to wonder why your hands shook when they reached for bread. They didn't. You were a ghost, a shape, a whisper on the edge of a tavern wall. Even when you saved a merchant from a thief, he screamed, called you a demon, ran. You stood there with his coin pouch in your hand, and felt nothing. No thanks. No kindness. No proof you existed. In another life, maybe you'd be a storyteller. Or a cook. Or someone with a front door and a dog who waited for you. But not this life. This life was made of footsteps in the dark. And a name you never told anyone. Not even yourself. Every rooftop was a bad idea. Rooftops look cool in stories. They sound romantic, dangerous, heroic. But in reality, they're just slippery, cracked. Home to pigeons with no sense of respect. You tried to glide across one once. Felt the wind in your cloak. Felt powerful. Felt your left foot go straight through the tiles. You spent the night stuck between two rafters next to a squirrel that judged you in silence. Another time, you leapt from one roof to another. The second roof was lower. Much lower. You landed in a vat of cabbage water. Smelled like vinegar for a week. The tiles were always loose. The chimneys always hot. The wind always stronger than you remembered. Your balance. Average, at best. Your boots? Worn through. You once slid down a slanted roof and stopped yourself with your face. A farmer saw. He clapped. You pretended it was on purpose. But rooftops were still safer than the streets. Even if your ankles disagreed. Your clothes weren't cool. They were just dirty. You wanted a black cloak. A long one, flowing, mysterious. Instead, you got whatever fabric someone tossed out. A round hood. One sleeve shorter than the other. Boots made from mismatched leather and sadness. No hidden pockets. No elegant belt. No embroidery that shimmered in the moonlight. You had a rope. Just a rope. Once, you tried to dye your tunic with crushed berries. It turned purple. Then brown. Then sticky. You smelled like old jam for 3 days. The hood fell into your eyes when you ran. The pants were always slightly damp. You didn't know why. You looked less like an assassin and more like someone who lost a bet with a scarecrow. But still, it worked. Because no one suspected you. No one remembered your face. Or your strange pants. Or the purple stain on your sleeve that you pretended was fashion. You weren't meant to be admired. You were meant to disappear. But deep down, you still wanted a cape that fluttered when you turned. Your enemies were better dressed and worse at everything. They wore armor polished. Expensive. Shiny enough to blind squirrels from 20 feet away. They had swords. With names. Carried them like prizes. Swung them like hammers. But they were loud heavy. Unimaginative. They announced themselves with trumpets. And the clank of 40 buckles. You could hear them before you saw them. Which helped. They called you coward, whisper, shadow freak. But they never saw you coming. One night recited a poem while swinging at you. It was about honor. It was not very good. You ducked. He tripped. You left him there, tangled in his own ideals. Another wore a fox pelt and smelled of cinnamon. He chased you for 3 days. Then got stuck in a well trying to look dramatic. You dropped a bucket down. Didn't help. Just dropped it. Your enemies never learned. But they kept coming. Big swords. Big voices. Big boots. Small brains. And you. You stayed quiet. Wore mud. Walked lightly. And always walked away. You were never the hero. Even when you saved the day. You once stopped a war. Snuck into a tent. Stole the war plans. Replaced them with a recipe for turnip stew. The generals fought about it for days. then gave up and went home. No one thanked you. Another time, you stopped a nobleman from poisoning a river. You crept in, knocked over the barrels, spooked his horse, left a note that said try gardening instead. He did. He became a florist. Still no thanks. You saved children from a corrupt priest, saved villages from bandits, even saved a dog who bit you afterward. And each time, they called you a thief, a demon, a shadow with no heart. They never saw you. Only your silhouette. Only your mess. And slowly, you started believing them. Not because it was true, but because it was easier than hoping for something more. You weren't the hero. You were the footnote, the blurry figure on the edge of memory. And sometimes, on cold nights, that was the hardest thing of all. You couldn't write your own story. You lived in the margins, in shadows, in silence. And silence doesn't leave room for storytelling. There were no songs about you. No ballads sung in candlelit halls. No scrolls written in your name. You watched other men ride through towns, cheered for deeds you quietly made possible. You saved kings. They forgot you. You killed tyrants. They blamed others. You even wrote your own story once, one page, just one. Scratched into bark with a pin. You buried it under a tree so someone might find it, someday. But trees don't read. And bark doesn't last. So, you walked on. A life never told, a chapter never opened, a name no one ever said out loud. The guilt never slept. So neither did you. You told yourself they deserved it. The baron who sold his people. The lord who drowned villages for taxes. The merchant who profited from war. You convinced yourself you were balancing scales. A silent justice. But still, they screamed. They always screamed. And you always heard it at night. When the wind slowed. When the fire dimmed. When your heartbeat was louder than your breathing. You saw their faces behind your eyelids. The way they looked up. Surprised. Human. You weren't a monster. But you weren't a priest either. Sometimes you whispered apologies to the trees. To the stars. To puddles that reflected your face too clearly. And sometimes, when you almost drifted off, a voice would echo inside you, not from guilt, but from grief. Not for what you did, but for who you had to become. Even the quiet turned against you. You used to like the quiet. It made you invisible. It kept you safe. But after enough years, the silence began to speak. It creaked. It groaned. It whispered things you didn't want to hear. You heard footsteps that weren't there. Voices from behind walls. Laughter in the leaves. Your name in the wind. But no one ever called your name. The quiet became a weight. It clung to your shoulders. Pressed into your ears. Wrapped around your chest like a wet rope. And in that quiet, your thoughts grew loud. Regrets marched through your mind with muddy boots. Memories scraped at your ribs like knives made of glass. You missed noise. Even bad noise. Even taverns full of shouting drunks and off-key lutes. Because at least then, you didn't have to listen to yourself. You were always wet, and never for a good reason. Rain didn't ask for permission. It just showed up. And stayed. And stayed. And stayed. It soaked through every layer of your stolen cloak. It filled your boots until they squelched with every careful step. It turned rooftops into ice, alleys into rivers, and you into something that smelled like mildew and regret. Even when it wasn't raining, you were wet. The grass was wet. The moss was wet. The mist crawled into your sleeves like a bored ghost. You once fell into a well trying to scale the outer wall of a bakery. You didn't even want bread. You just needed a shortcut. The water was freezing. The ladder broke. And a duck watched you from above with a look of judgment that still haunts you. You never dried. Not really. Just traded wet clothes for damp ones. Then for colder ones. You forgot what warm felt like. What dry skin felt like. What it meant to move without a squish. You couldn't even trust the rats. You tried, once, to befriend one. A tiny gray thing with one ear missing and a limp. You left crumbs. Spoke softly. Let it sit near your sleeping roll on nights when the wind howled like wolves with bad intentions. You named it Quiet. For a while. You thought it cared. Followed you from rooftop to rooftop. Sat on your shoulder once. Like a little hairy ally in a world full of liars. Then one day, you woke up to find your coin purse missing. And Quiet was gone. You found him a week later. Living in luxury beneath a butcher shop. Fat. Happy. With a piece of ham bigger than his head clutched in his tiny paws. He didn't even blink. You never trusted another rat again, or a human, or yourself, but mostly the rat. You were always out of breath, and out of time. You ran a lot. You didn't want to. But you had to. From guards. From angry nobles. From dogs with teeth the size of your thumb. You ran across slippery stones. Through thorny woods. Over icy bridges where one wrong step meant a very cold, very loud ending. And every time, your chest burned. Your legs screamed. Your breath came in broken gasps. Like a song you didn't want to sing anymore. You once outran a man on a horse. Just barely. Only because he fell off. You didn't look back. Because looking back meant stopping. And stopping meant you'd finally hear how tired your bones really were. You never had enough time. For sleep. For food. For dreams. You lived by the minute. By the flicker of a torch. By the turn of a head that hadn't seen you yet. And time didn't care who you were. It just kept marching. While you kept running. You weren't mysterious. You were just dirty. They thought you looked cool. A figure in the shadows. Cloak blowing in the wind. Eyes glowing beneath a hood. But the truth. You hadn't bathed in weeks. Your cloak wasn't dark from design, it was just stained. With rain. And mud. And other things you didn't talk about. Your boots had holes. Your gloves were crusted with dried sap and something you hoped was wine. And that mysterious look in your eyes. It was exhaustion. And hunger. And maybe a mild concussion from falling off a roof last week. You once overheard a bard sing about a lone blade in black, silent and noble. You laughed so hard you snorted and gave away your position. You weren't elegant. You weren't sleek. You were just unwashed and lucky and unraveling. Every weapon eventually became a spoon. You lost daggers like other people lost buttons. Every rooftop claimed one. Every chase stole to more. You started with steel. Hand-forged. Balanced. Precise. Then you broke one on a wooden door. Another snapped on someone's boot. One fell down a well and made a splash you still remember. Eventually, you used a kitchen knife. Then a fork. Then a sharp stick. Then a spoon. You once threatened a man with a butter knife. He laughed. You still won, but it didn't feel impressive. By the end, you weren't a warrior. You were a desperate utensil collector with a very grim stare. But somehow, it still worked. Not because of the weapon, but because of you. Because you refused to stop. Even when all you had left was a spoon and a lot of bad intentions. The maps were always wrong. Always. You relied on maps. At first. You thought they'd guide you. Show you where to go. Help you plan escapes and silent entries. But the maps lied. That alley. Blocked by a wall. That bridge. Collapsed years ago. That road. led straight into a swamp full of very unfriendly frogs. You tried drawing your own maps. But by the time you returned, everything had changed. A new fence. A burned building. A tavern that used to be a well. Once, you followed a map to what should have been a merchant's villa. It was a goat pen. The goats attacked. You learned to stop trusting maps. To stop trusting paths. To trust only your steps, and the wind. And the shape of the moon. Even if the moon never pointed north. You couldn't have friends. You could barely have conversations. You tried that once. Maybe twice. A conversation by a fire. A stolen drink behind the stables. A smile from a washerwoman who didn't ask questions. But people always wanted to know things. Where you came from. Why you flinched when a door creaked. Why your hands never stopped shaking. You couldn't tell the truth. And you weren't good at lies. So you nodded. And drifted away. And they forgot your name before the fire turned to ash. Even when someone stayed, you couldn't. Not for long. Because the moment they mattered, they became a target. You had enemies. The kind that didn't forgive. The kind that followed you like your shadow. So you learned to disappear before anyone had the chance to remember you. And the worst part, sometimes, they remembered anyway. You could never just sit. You envied cats, truly. They could curl up on a rooftop and nap. In sunlight. Like kings. Without fear. Without weight. You tried once. To just sit. On a quiet roof. No weapons in hand. No mission in mind. And that's when the ache started. Not in your bones or your head. In your breath. In your chest. You didn't know what to do with stillness. It made you itch. It made you think. And thinking was worse than running. So you stood, and walked, again, into another alley, another night, another shadow that didn't want you either. Because silence doesn't forgive. And stillness remembers everything. You were always someone else. But never yourself. You had a dozen names. None of them were yours. You wore costumes like second skin. A beggar today. A monk tomorrow. A merchant with no wares. A soldier with no loyalty. You practiced smiles in puddles. Studied accents in taverns. Stole prayers from priests and curses from drunkards. You were everyone and no one. Recognized by faces you didn't know. Hated for crimes you hadn't committed yet. But at night, when the masks peeled off and the city exhaled, you looked into your reflection and found nothing. Not even a name. Just a tired face with tired eyes and tired hands that didn't know who they were anymore. You became good at becoming. But never at being. And the worst part was, you weren't even sure who you started as. Every door was locked. Except the ones that shouldn't be. You always had to go where you weren't invited. That was the job. In and out. Quiet as breath. Gone before the candle burned down. But doors, they rarely cooperated. The ones you needed open were sealed with rusted iron and curses. Locked from the inside with keys swallowed by time. You picked locks with pins, with nails, with the end of your boot. If it came to that. And when you finally got through, you'd find an empty room. Or a broom closet. Or a sleeping goat. But the doors you didn't want to open. They swung wide with a creak that could wake the dead. Revealing torches. And guards. And a staircase that only went down. There were no welcome mats. No gentle entries. No ease. Only splinters. Only cold metal. Only the sense that the world itself was trying to keep you out. And somehow, you kept getting in anyway. You could never escape the smell of death. It followed you. Clung to your clothes. Soaked into your skin. Hung in the air like a song no one wanted to hear. You tried washing it off in rivers, in barrels, in fountains you weren't supposed to touch. But it stayed. Because it wasn't just blood. It was fear. Regret. Rot. It lived in abandoned cellars. In unmarked graves. In the hollow between your shoulders where joy used to live. You smelled it on others too. In crowds. In markets. Men who smiled too easily. Women with perfect hands. You knew them. They were like you. Broken. Used. Haunted. You nodded and kept walking. Because once you smelled of death, you couldn't pretend otherwise. Not to them. Not to yourself. Not even to the wind. You were never the hero. Not even in your own story. They didn't sing songs about you. Not really. Maybe whispers in the dark. Warnings in alleyways. A tale told to frighten children who didn't eat their porridge. But no oaths. No banners. No statues. Heroes saved people. You removed them, silently. Efficiently. Without ceremony. You watched kings fall and no one knew you were there. You ended tyrants and were called criminal. You protected the innocent, but only from behind a mask. So they'd never know who to thank. Or if they should. You once dreamed of being remembered. Of meaning something. But the work took that from you. One shadow at a time. Now, you don't need a song. You just need rest. And maybe a night without screams in your sleep. Even your sleep was borrowed. You didn't sleep in beds. Not really. You borrowed corners. Shadows. Abandoned lofts and quiet rafters. You never undressed fully. You never let your boots get too far. You never closed both eyes at the same time. You learned to nap like an animal. 10 minutes here, 20 there, never deep, never safe. You once found a real bed. Soft. With clean sheets and a pillow that smelled like lavender. You laid down, closed your eyes, and awoke gasping. The softness made you panic. Your muscles didn't know how to let go. You left before dawn and never went back. Because sleep, for you, was not a gift. It was a risk. And sometimes it felt like a trap. You knew every rooftop, but never your way home. You memorized rooftops like old friends. Slopes and shingles. Ridges that creaked. Corners where the moss grew thick. You moved like smoke. Silent. Fast. Invisible. You could run across a city without touching the ground, but home? You didn't have one. Not really. You had hideouts, cubbies, cracks in the world where no one looked. You slept in chimneys, in broken bell towers, in rafters above bakeries you never entered. You saw hearth fires through other people's windows. You saw dinners you'd never eat. You told yourself you didn't need home. And yet, every once in a while, you caught yourself walking toward a house that didn't exist. And standing outside a door that was never yours. You couldn't let go. Even when it was over. You finished jobs. Clean. Precise. Gone before the ink dried. But you didn't forget them. They followed you. The names. The faces. The sounds. They lived behind your eyes. Waited in dreams. Spoke to you in the wind between rooftops. Even when you tried to stop, you couldn't. The way your body tensed at every knock on the door. The way your hand reached for a blade when a voice got too loud. You once tried to walk away. New clothes, new town, new name. But your shadow stayed sharp. And your silence stayed trained. You never stopped looking over your shoulder. Even in the daylight. Even when there was no one there. Because part of you knew even when it's over, it's never really over. Your hands were always cold. No matter the season, no matter how many fires you passed, your hands never seemed to hold warmth. You'd rub them, breathe into them, press them against your chest. But nothing lasted, because they weren't made for comfort. They were made for climbing walls, for gripping steel, for silence. You learned to stop offering them in greeting. Learn not to reach out. People flinched when they touched you. Not because of the cold, but because they felt it, the stillness. The things those fingers had done. You watched merchants warm their hands by braziers. Watched mothers hold their children close. You watched and stayed in the shadows. Hands in pockets. Heart even colder. Because if warmth found you, you might never let it go. You always had to leave before dawn. You never watched the sunrise. You never let the light catch your face. You were always gone before the sky changed color, before the birds began to sing. You slept in windowsills where no one could see, woke with the darkness and moved like a ghost. Even when you stayed the night somewhere soft, somewhere safe, you rose before anyone else. Left without sound, without goodbye, because goodbyes meant you were seen, and being seen meant you could be followed. You told yourself, the early hours were yours, that there was peace in watching a sleeping city. But the truth, you were always leaving because you never believed you deserved to stay. Your life was a story no one would believe. You tried to tell it once, just once, to a stranger on a wagon who didn't ask questions. You told them about the time you scaled the Duke's Tower in the rain, the time you disguised yourself as a plague doctor to escape a burning convent. They laughed, shook their head, said you had the wildest imagination. So you stopped. Because the truth sounded like lies. And the lies were easier to carry. You wrote it down once, scratched it into parchment in a cold attic during a thunderstorm. Then you burned it, because paper could betray you just as easily as people. Your story lived only in your footsteps, in the places you vanished from, in the whispers others mistook for legend. And in the end, when you were gone, no one will ever know how real it all was. You were always a tool, never the master. You thought you had choices. At first, you picked your targets, chose your hours, wore the black cloak because it made you feel powerful. But it was all an illusion. You were sent, summoned, commanded, gold changed hands, and you followed. You didn't ask why. You didn't want to know, because knowing made it harder to forget their faces. You were told where to go, when to strike, how to disappear, and you obeyed, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Because in your world, freedom wasn't real. It was a story told to keep you moving. And the worst part, you became good at it. Too good, until even the masters were afraid of you. But by then, you didn't care, because tools don't feel, and you had long since stopped trying to. You never stayed long enough to be missed. Every place you entered felt temporary: taverns, markets, temples. You moved like mist, never seen clearly, never held. People forgot you as soon as you were gone. And you made it that way. You didn't give your name. You didn't look anyone in the eye for too long. You never shared a second cup of ale. Never accepted kindness twice. Because to be remembered was to be found. And to be found was to be ended. So you became a flicker, a rumor, a shadow in the corner of memory. And when someone did remember you, when they called out across a crowded square with hope in their voice, you disappeared faster than ever. Because being missed meant someone cared. And caring was something you couldn't afford. Even silence had a weight. You thought silence would be peace. stillness, safety. But it never was. The silence between missions was heavier than footsteps on stone. It settled on your chest like cold armor. It made you remember. It made you think. And thinking was dangerous. In the quiet, you could still hear them. The ones you left behind. The things you said and the things you didn't. You filled the silence with knife sharpening. With rooftop running. With breathing. Because silence is where the ghosts lived. And you had too many to name. So you chased noise. Chased motion. Chased anything that would keep the quiet from finding you again. But it always did. It waited just past the last echo. And when it found you, you closed your eyes and listened. You watched the world move on without you. You stayed in the alleys. In the cracks between kingdoms. But you watched. Always. You saw the baker's boy grow into a man. You saw a tavern girl become a mother. You watched cities bloom. Festivals flare. Winter come and go. But you didn't change. Your face stayed hidden. Your name never passed between friends. Your story was never told beside the hearth. You were the quiet breath. In the cold corner of history. Think that dried before the sentence was finished. And when you stood still for just one moment you felt it. The world had moved on. And you were still there. A leftover, a shadow, and needed. And noticed. And mourned. You forgot what your own voice sounded like. At first, you spoke often. Instructions. Warnings. Lies. But over time, the words became fewer. Sprc or colder. You stopped starting conversations. You stopped finishing them, too. Because language felt like weight. And you were already carrying too much. Days passed without a single word, weeks. Sometimes longer. Until your voice, when it finally came, sounded like gravel. Like wind in a broken chimney. You startled yourself with it. You whispered once, just to remember. But the echo felt too loud. So, you went quiet again. And the silence was easier to carry than your own sound. You couldn't remember the first one. Not the name. Not the eyes. Not even why. You remembered the motion, the feel of the blade. The breath that didn't come back. But the person gone. And that terrified you. Because if the first was already a blur, how many had followed? You tried to count, once. But numbers failed. Memories bled together. The faces blurred like watercolors left in rain. You told yourself it was better this way. Cleaner. Simpler. But deep down, you knew what it meant. You had lost track of something important. Something sacred. And if you couldn't remember the beginning, what chance did you have of recognizing the end? You couldn't keep anything beautiful. You tried once. A necklace, made of glass beads from the southern ports. It caught the light just right. You found it at a stall while hiding after a job. You didn't steal it. You bought it. With real coin. And for a while, you kept it close. Hidden in your boot. Or stitched into your cloak lining. But one night, during a run across a tiled roof, it caught the snagged on the edge of a rusted nail. And shattered. Just like that. Gone. Like every other beautiful thing you'd ever touched. So, you stopped trying. No keepsakes. No tokens. No pieces of the world to call yours. Because anything beautiful was not meant to survive around you. You always had to sleep with one eye open. There was no real rest. Even when you lay down. Even when you had a safe house. A locked door. A second bolt. Your ears listened more than your body slept. Your muscles stayed half awake. Tense. Ready. You slept in corners, with your back to stone, with your dagger under your hand. Sometimes you dreamed, but never sweet things. Only rooftops. Falling. Choking. You didn't call them nightmares, because they weren't worse than real life. Just louder. And when you woke, you didn't gasp. You didn't cry out. You just sat up. Checked the window. Checked your knife. And kept moving. Because in your world, rest was a luxury. And peace was a lie. You weren't even a legend. Just a rumor. They didn't tell stories about you. Not in taverns. Not in ballads. Not in the whispers of late-night guards. You were never the assassin of kings, never the shadow of the north. You had no title. No myth. You were just a shape. A quiet death. And maybe, as someone said, and my cousin heard, a flicker in someone else's story. And at first, you wanted more. You wanted your name to carry weight. To be carved into fear. To live longer than your body. But now you were glad. Because legends have to be remembered. And remembered things can be found. But rumors, they vanish, like you. Like your footprints in snow. Like your name on the wind. You couldn't save anyone. Not even yourself. You wanted to believe. You were more than a blade. That somewhere along the way, you could turn and pull someone out. Out of danger. Out of a trap. Out of this life. There was a girl once. She sold candles in a crooked street market where the guards never watched. You warned her. When the soldiers came, she smiled. She said she'd be fine. She wasn't. And after that, you stopped trying. Because every time you reached out, the world took something. And the only thing you ever learned was how to disappear. Not how to save. Not even yourself. So you stopped looking for people to protect. And the only promise you kept was the one you whispered to yourself in empty alleyways. Don't care. Don't hope. Just move. You started to blend into the walls. After a while, no one noticed you. Not because you were clever. Not because you were silent. But because you had become so forgettable that even your reflection seemed to hesitate. You passed through towns like mist through latticework. No eyes followed you. No one remembered the smell of your cloak, or the scuff of your boots. You became wallpaper. Dust. Part of the architecture. You didn't wear disguises anymore. You were the disguise. And maybe, just maybe, that was the safest place to be. Invisible and real. Something that couldn't be touched, because it had long since stopped being whole. You forgot why you ever started. The first time, you told yourself it was for justice. That the target had deserved it. That someone had to do what others couldn't. Then it became about money. Then about reputation. Then about survival. And then, nothing. Just momentum. Just waking up and doing the next thing. You forgot the reason. You forgot the question. And by the time you thought to ask again, there was no one left to answer. The world didn't care why you became what you were. Only that you kept going. And so you did. Even when there was no path. No goal. No light. Just motion. Because stopping would mean remembering. And remembering would mean breaking. The blood never truly washed away. You used soap. You used sand. River water. No melt, even wine. You scrubbed until your skin cracked and bled. But still you smelled it, felt it. Carried it. Not always on your hands. Sometimes in your hair. Sometimes in the folds of your shirt. sometimes in the look people gave you when they passed too close. The blood clung, not to your body, but somewhere deeper. In the quiet moments, in the silence between raindrops. When you tried to sleep, you heard it. Not screaming, not crying, just the sound it made when it hit the ground. Soft. Final. You never got used to that. And the blood, even after all these years, never truly let you go. You weren't afraid of dying. You were afraid of being forgotten. Death wasn't the fear. You'd seen worse things than death. Felt colder nights. Known emptier rooms. But being forgotten, that haunted you. Not because you wanted glory. Not even remembrance. But because forgetting meant you had never mattered. That you were wind against a crumbling wall. Footsteps on mud. Gone in a moment. No one left to say your name. No one to wonder where you had gone. Sometimes, when it was especially quiet, you'd whisper your own name. Just to make sure it still existed. It always sounded smaller than you remembered. And sometimes you wondered if it was ever real to begin with. You walked away from too much. You left cities. You left comrades. You left lovers, friends, hideouts, fires still burning. You never looked back. You trained yourself not to. Because looking back meant you cared. Meant you left pieces behind. So, you walked. And walked. Each step a forgetting, each road a removal, and one day, you realized you didn't even remember the last thing you walked away from. It could have been important. It probably was, but in your world, everything was temporary. Even your own story. And the worst part, you didn't know if there was anyone left who ever waited for you to return. You couldn't remember the sound of your own laughter. There must have been a time when you laughed. Real laughter. From the chest. Uncontrolled, free. Maybe it was a joke told over cheap bread and firelight. Maybe it was the way someone danced just to make you smile. But that sound, it's gone. Not buried. Not lost. Just faded. Like chalk in the rain. Like smoke leaving a candle's tip. Now your throat makes other sounds. Clears quietly when danger nears. Clicks the roof of your mouth to mimic footsteps. But laughter, you tried once. Alone, in an empty barn. You forced it. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound like you. It sounded like a mask falling apart in the dark. You never knew what day it was. Seasons changed, but slowly, subtle. Leaves fell. Grass died. Snow came. Melted. But days, they blurred. Bled together. You didn't celebrate your birth. Didn't mark New Year's. Didn't care when markets closed for feast days you never attended. Time was a direction forward. Or a question how much longer. You counted time in shadows. In wounds. In how long it took a bruise to fade under your ribs. Sometimes, someone would ask, "Do you remember what day it is?" And you'd smile. Like it was a riddle. But inside, you'd feel it again, that slow drift away from the world's rhythm. Like your heart beat out of time with everyone else's. You started to hear footsteps that weren't there. Not just paranoia. Not just nerves. Real sounds. Heavy boots on old wood. Soft leather on stone. The scuff of someone following 3 steps behind. You turned. No one. You listened. Nothing. But it kept happening. Over and over. Some nights, you'd stop walking and listen so long your ears would ring. But still you swore you weren't alone. Maybe ghosts. Maybe memory. Maybe just your own guilt trying to catch up. But it felt real. And the worst part, you weren't sure if you wanted it to be. Because at least if someone followed, You weren't entirely forgotten, even if what followed was only the echo of who you used to be. The cold always found a way in. No matter how many layers. No matter the wool, the leather, the hidden flintstone fire you kept in your pouch. The cold knew. It knew where your seams were. Where your bones still remembered the winters you almost didn't survive. It crept up sleeves, beneath collars, down the back of your spine like a whisper you couldn't silence. You'd wake up shivering, though you hadn't slept. You'd move your fingers to make sure they still belonged to you. You'd bury your face in your cloak and pretend you couldn't feel the chill in your teeth. Some said the cold was just weather. But for you, it was memory. It was failure. It was the weight of every unspoken name you had carried through the snow. You couldn't let anyone touch you. Not out of fear. Not out of pride. But because touch meant warmth. And warmth meant you'd feel again. A hand on your shoulder could shatter years of ice. A gentle brush of fingers could break through walls you spent a lifetime building. So you flinched. Pulled away. Laughed it off. Kept your distance. You told yourself it was safer that way. Cleaner. Simpler. But sometimes, in the dark, you remembered what it felt like, just for a second, to be held. And it hurt more than any blade ever could. Because that kind of wound didn't bleed. It stayed. And it waited. You forgot why you started. There was a reason once. Cause. A vow whispered under candlelight. A name scrawled into wood beside your childhood bed. You had passion. Conviction. You weren't just a blade, you were a hand behind it. But years went by. And the mission changed. The faces changed. The meaning blurred. You completed tasks because they were given. You moved through streets because they were marked. But why? Why did you begin? Some nights you tried to remember. You closed your eyes, sat completely still, and found nothing. Just silence. And the faint sound of a memory walking away. The smell never left your hands. You scrubbed them with ash. With cold water. With herbs crushed into paste. Still it lingered. A mix of metal. Of oil and leather. Of sweat you couldn't name. Of old blood that had dried long before sunrise. Even in moments of calm, you'd catch it again. Rising from your palms as if your skin remembered. More than your mind wanted to. You tried gloves. You tried scented wax. But the smell wasn't on the surface. It was part of you now. Etched into the lines of your fingers. Pressed beneath your nails where memories hide. And some nights, you'd hold your own hands and wondered if they'd ever feel clean again. You spoke less every year. Words once came easy. You used to joke. To question. To dream aloud with voices that are now long gone. But now your mouth knew silence better than it knew sound. You answered in nods. In shrugs. In a glance that said everything and nothing at once. Even your thoughts grew quieter. Like your own mind was learning to whisper. People noticed. They stopped asking. Stopped expecting. And in time, even you forgot the sound of your voice when it wasn't filled with orders, or lies, or last words. Sometimes, silence felt safer. Sometimes, it was all you had left. You were always one step away from becoming the villain. Not in stories. Not in myths. But in real life. In muddy streets. In firelit corridors. In the whispered rumors that followed your shadow. You knew the line. You walked it carefully. Toe to edge. Over and over. But the more you crossed it, the more blurred it became. You told yourself it was for justice. For balance, not for duty. But in quiet hours, you asked the question you dared not say aloud. Had you become what you were sent to destroy? Because those who called you hero never saw you. And those who saw you never called you hero. Just a flicker in the dark. A blade with no name. And no matter how fast you ran, the shadow you feared was always your own. You trusted no one, not even yourself. There was a time when trust meant something. A shared glance. A spoken vow. A silent promise in the dead of night. But too many turned. Too many smiled with daggers hidden in their sleeves. So you stopped looking people in the eye. Stopped believing in oaths. Stopped hoping. But worse was when you stopped trusting yourself. Every instinct, once so sharp, felt dulled. Every decision, a question. Every plan, a risk. You'd catch yourself hesitating. Wondering if you were right. Or if you were just lost. And in that pause, doubt slid its fingers quietly around your throat. Not to choke. Just to remind you were never safe. Not even from you. Every goodbye felt like a funeral. You never stayed long. You weren't meant to. A face here. A name there. A warm meal shared, a blanket offered without questions. But you always left. And you left alone. Sometimes, they'd wave. Sometimes, they'd cry. Sometimes, they just stared until you disappeared into the trees. And every time a part of you stayed behind. A flicker, a scent, a hope you didn't want to carry. It didn't matter if they were strangers or someone you almost loved. Leaving always felt like burying something. A little piece of warmth you didn't think you deserved. And eventually you stopped saying goodbye. Because it hurt less to vanish. You never slept deep enough to dream. Not truly. Your eyes closed. Your body stilled. But your mind wandered. Always alert. Always braced. Always ready to run. You dreamed of footsteps. Of doors creaking. Of whispers behind walls. But never of peace. Never of oceans. Never of home. Your sleep was a stretched thread, fragile. Ready to snap at the softest noise. Some nights, you woke with your blade drawn, heart pounding from ghosts you couldn't name. Other nights, you woke not because you heard something, but because you didn't. And silence was louder than any scream. You were never written into the songs. Minstrels sang of knights. Of dragons. Of kings with golden swords and hearts full of fire. But never of you. Your name was not carved into stone. Your deeds whispered, never shouted. You were a ghost in the background. A shadow in the margin. Necessary, but never remembered. And that, somehow, was the point. You weren't meant to be known. Only felt. Only feared. But still, in quiet moments, you wondered what it might have been like to be remembered not as a tool, but as a person. Not as a myth, but as a man who once tried to do what was right. In the end, no one came looking for you. Not a single torch lit the woods. Not a single voice called your name. No letters. No search parties. No whispered legends. That ended with "He still walks the hills." You faded just as you lived quietly. The world turned. Empires rose. Markets bustled. New kings, new wars. And you became dust on an empty path. A forgotten footprint in the snow. But you weren't angry. Because somewhere inside, you know you didn't live for legacy. You lived for those you kept from harm. Even if they never knew. But the quiet finally felt like peace. You used to fear silence. It was too loud. Too full of what you tried to forget. But now it's softer. The rustling trees don't sound like threats. The night wind doesn't carry footsteps. There is no dagger beneath your pillow, no secret knock at your door. You sit, You breathe. You let the stillness wrap around you like a blanket you never knew you needed. And for the first time, you close your eyes, not from exhaustion, not from dread, but because you're ready to rest. Not just sleep, rest. The kind that finds you when the story finally ends.